It's a pleasure to bring to the stage in a moment Christoph Lienau from the Institute of Physics and the Center of Interface Science at the Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg in Germany. Christoph Lienau is a professor of experimental physics at the University of Oldenburg. After receiving his PhD in physical chemistry in Göttingen, he worked as a postdoc with Ahmed Sawail at Caltech and studied femtosecond dynamics and solution. In 1995, he became a scientific staff member of the newly founded Max Born Institute, initiating research in ultrafast nano-optics, combining low temperature and ultrafast near-field spectroscopy and nanospectroscopy. In 2006, he became a full professor in physics at Oldenburg. He's published more than 150 full scientific publications in journals and has given more than 100 invited and plenary talks, and he holds 5 patents. He's a fellow of the OSA, vice chair of the Semiconductor Physics Division of the German Physical Society, and his interests are primarily in ultrafast nano and quantum optics. He's got a very long title, which is going to go on the screen in a moment, so I'll leave it to him to introduce his talk. Let's give another warm welcome to Christoph Lienau.
Okay, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, it's a big honor to present some of the work that my group has done over the last 3-4 years or so on controlling and manipulating basically charge motion in different types of devices, ranging from plasmonic devices to solar cells, actually. And the work will focus a little bit on asking the question whether we can see what electrons are doing in such devices at room temperature and on ultrafast timescales. So we will be dealing with the interaction of light and nanostructures, and in principle that's relatively simple. So basically you take short light paths, this will set the electrons into motion. These electrons will remit electric fields, and these real electric fields are the things that we measure in the laboratory. The important point here is that at room temperature, mostly these electric fields are gone after 10 femtoseconds or so. So there's a natural timescale involved here, and this natural timescale is femtoseconds. So you better want to speed up if you want to do these experiments, if you want to probe. Okay. Having a single nanostructure is a little boring. So much of the action comes as soon as you go from 1 to 2 nanostructures, because then energy can be transferred. If you want to really learn something about it, talk to the chairman of this session, because he knows this much better than I do. So I will just give a brief introduction. Basically, there's 2 processes, 2 fundamental processes that can happen. One is energy transfer, or exciton transfer, and that's the basis for much of what we have in optical switching, in light harvesting, in optical sensing, and so on and so forth. You will also hear more about this from Harry Atwater. But there's also charge transfer, and charge transfer, so basically the photoinduced optical excitation of a nanostructure and then the motion of an electron from one nanostructure to the other, is at the basis of function of solar cells, biological reaction centers, or photocatalysis, for example. That's known. That's very old stuff. There's thousands of papers about this. The point here is that mostly these processes are considered as being incoherent processes. So the exciton, or the electron, is treated as a classical particle, and it's just jumping over from one nanostructure to the other. So what we want to study a little bit here, or the question that we want to ask is, okay, what's the role of quantum dynamics? Is it necessary, or is it relevant to basically to think about optical excitations, electron-hole pairs, as quantum excitations, and will there be something like strong coupling, so basically the coherent exchange of wave packets, either excitonic wave packets or charged wave packets, as soon as we bring 2 nanostructures close to each other? And more fundamentally, is this quantum mechanics important, or is quantum dynamics important for energy conversion? Yeah, okay, you know we're German, so we're very much concerned about renewable energy. So is there any, quantum dynamics that is playing a role that we need to understand if we want to build better solar cells, for example? Okay, so that's going to be the main topic of this talk. There's a little bit of physics that I need to introduce. You know this from textbook. If you have two pure quantum states and you here denote it as 0 and 1, and that's pure states at certain energies, and you couple them by some mechanism here, you will form new hybrid states. Yeah? Molecular states, for example, yeah, with here, which share the identity of the uncoupled states. You get this from this formula here. That's very basic quantum mechanics, no problem. Yeah? At room temperature in the nanostructures, you unfortunately do not have these isolated pure quantum states, but you have losses. You have dephasing, you have decoherence, you have inhomogeneous broadening, you name it. So your pure quantum states are no longer pure quantum states, but there's basically some damping terms that are entering here. Yeah? And this makes this simple formula pretty nasty, because you will see that these new hybrid states are now only formed if the coupling exceeds the losses. Yeah? So that's very elementary, and that's where typically the talk stops, because these losses are fundamentally quick, so they're like on this 10 femtosecond timescale, so you have to make the coupling very large, extremely large to see this, okay? So typically it's considered to be unimportant in most cases to even think about basically quantum coherence in the context of energy exchange or charge exchange, okay? There's a final slide that I want to show to introduce how one can look into this, and that's basically time-resolved spectroscopy. So there's something that is connected to this strong coupling, and that's Rabi oscillations. Let's assume that you have a super short laser, delta pulse, that sort of excites these two coupled eigenstates here. Yeah? Then basically you can think about this as transferring population from one of the states to the other states. Yeah? So there's a periodic exchange of energy between the coupled states. Yeah? And this occurs on a timescale that is given by the strength of this coupling, so you want to see some oscillations here in real time if possible, if you want to get insight into these coupling phenomena. Again, this is nothing that comes to a surprise. You can watch this on YouTube. Yeah? So here, for example, yeah, you see two magnets. You have an impulsive excitation, that's the finger, yeah? And then you have this periodic flow. You not just have the oscillation of each of these magnetic pendula, but you also have the periodic flow of the energy between one and the other, okay? And here this happens on a time scale of a second or so. In some of the experiments that I will show in a second or in a few minutes or so, it will happen 15 orders of magnitude or 14 orders of magnitude faster, and also the length scales that are involved are a little bit shorter. Here it's a few like this size or so, a few centimeters or so. We're talking nanometers or so. Yeah, so typical physics approach, let's make things faster and smaller. Okay, so I will discuss this in the context of various examples. The first one deals with coupling between excitons and plasmons. The second one deals with artificial light harvesting. And the third one with organic solar cells, so very complex phenomena. I should say that the experimental tools that I will be using are just rather old-fashioned femtosecond spectroscopy in this first main part of the talk. So if ever I have time, I also want to introduce that in our group we're doing a little bit more fancy stuff that tries to develop new techniques that can probe such excitations on 10 femtosecond timescales, but also with 10 nanometer or even less spatial resolution using both optical techniques, adiabatic nanofocusing spectroscopy, and particular ultrafast electron sources. Since probably I will not have time to talk about this, there will be some talks on that. Also at this conference, I want to advertise the invited talks by Markus Raschke and by Klaus Robers. They will discuss this in more detail if I don't have time. Okay. So I want to thank my people. We're a small group at a small university in the middle of nowhere, and I want to start with with the first example. Yeah? Here, that's a very simple system that we want to look at. It's a gold film, It's carved with some slits on it. The slit periodicity is a few hundreds of nanometers or so, roughly the wavelengths of light, and we want to cover this with just a thin layer of a dye film. Why would we want to do this? Well, because we want to switch plasmonic fields. So we want to achieve optical switching of a non-switchable material, because plasmon excitations are at the surface of metals basically have a weak nonlinearity, so we want to enhance nonlinearities, and we want to do this by forming new states, hybrid states, that are coupled states between excitons and plasmons. And we do this in a very simple approach. We take such a grating here, that's this one, it's a grating carved on a gold surface, and as you can see from just linear angle-dependent reflectivity spectra, you can, at certain resonance energies here, you can excite surface plasmon polariton excitations at the surface. Yeah? These are designed a little bit so to have very weak losses or so, but here basically you have a certain optical excitation, a basic optical excitation here, and that's the plasmon on the surface, okay? And now we cover this with a dye film. A dye film is something at the level of the discussion in this talk, very simple. It's a two-level system with a certain resonance energy and with a large dipole moment, and also tuned for having small losses. It's a j-aggregated cyanide dye that we put. Yeah? And the trick that we want to play is we actually want to put these little tiny dyes here into these localized fields here that exist, I hope you can see this, in these grooves on these slits. Because there we want to induce, at these positions, we want to induce a coupling between the excitons and the plasmons. Yeah? And it's important that this coupling strength scales with the amplitude of the electric field, and the amplitude of the electric field scales inversely proportional with the volume of the mode. So the more we go nano, the better we make the coupling, and that will be important. Okay, good. And you can see that this works because you look at the optical spectra of the combined system, and now you see level repulsion, or you see the formation of hybrid modes. You see dispersion relations here that show the formation of these, I have to learn how to do this here, of these lower and upper polariton hybrid exciton plasmon modes, or excimons as one might call them, or plexitons or so. Yeah? And the coupling is large, it's roughly 100 millivolts, so it exceeds the losses. So you're supposed to have Rabi oscillations, and you can do this in the experiment. So you impulsively excite this system, and you see wiggles there. Yeah? So you see exactly what is happening, what I've tried to show in this movie. You see basically this energy flowing between, so here you see plenty of oscillations here on a 20 femtosecond time scale in the reflectivity spectra taken with high time resolution. So you can basically watch in real time, in a sense, this energy flowing between the excitonic and the plasmonic system. Okay, good. In a sense, you may say, why bother? That's something that you saw already from the linear spectra, because you see the coupling. Yeah? But in these time-resolved experiments, you can learn a little more. You can basically compare this to theory, and from this comparison of theory, you can learn what's going on. Yeah? And what is going on here is that optical excitations of excitons in the system will shrink the coupling strength. So basically, you will have, I have introduced this coupling parameter, this Rabi coupling, yeah? And here, if you have excitons in the system, this will bleach the dipole moment. Bleaching the dipole moment reduces the coupling between excitons and plasmons, so you have a switch, yeah? And this switch is fast. It's faster than what you introduced. It's a little bit faster. It's on a 10 femtosecond or 20 femtosecond time scale, yeah? Okay, here we have a switch. We have developed a switch, so essentially we have transformed a metal mirror from a mirror to a switchable mirror. We can switch this reflectivity of the mirror at certain wavelengths on and off on a 10 femtosecond time scale. Question is that useful? We need many photons for doing this, so if we want to develop or transform this into something useful like a photonic transistor or so, we would need far too many photons for that. So if you want to really transfer this into technology or into something useful, you may think of implementing this in photonic transistor structures, like the one that I've shown here. Yeah? So basically, we want to make use of the ability of plasmons to being transformed into very small light fields here, and we want to let them interact on a short length scale with few excitons that are sitting there. Yeah? And what's the advantage that you can gain? Well, the advantage is that now, since you minimize the mode volume, since you here in the center in this antenna, you have a very small, very strongly confined mode, you can enhance the Rabi coupling, and hence you may eventually need just a single photon to switch a single exciton. Yeah? So you can enhance. That's at least what we expect will happen during the next 2-3 years. You can basically switch photons with photons on a level of basically field strength that is needed or photons numbers that is needed that is unprecedented. So that's what. And we believe that one of the key components here is to make use of these Rabi splittings here. And eventually, in the moment, we are limited by basically the size to which we can confine the light. And for that, we have developed a little bit of new technology to make such nano antennas with very small gap sizes here, because as I've shown, as I've introduced, the smaller you make the gap, the smaller you make the volume of the mode, the larger you make the coupling here. Yeah? So together with Carl Zeiss, with partners from industry, we've developed helium ion beam lithography as a tool to fabricate these gap sizes here, as you can see, with extremely high precision, such that we have antennas now with well-defined geometries and gap sizes of less than 5 nanometer here, and that will be the key to deposit nonlinear optical materials there and to implement basically switchable photonic devices here that work with very low photon numbers and very high speeds. Okay, so that was the first example. In the second example, I want to go away from excitons and plasmons and go a little bit more sort of complex, and I want to discuss the role of quantum coherence in artificial light harvesting. There's a big discussion in the moment about whether quantum coherence is important in natural systems. There are some people that are thinking that basically birds can fly into a certain direction because they can sense the magnetic field of the Earth by means of Rabi oscillations or overdamped Rabi oscillations. So there's a question to what extent one can use quantum coherence in nature to sort of generate new function. Yeah? And here I want to discuss an example of this. Yeah? I want to basically illustrate how light is transferred into charges in a model system that was designed some 20 years back by the group of Devon Gust and Tom Moore for mimicking solar energy conversion. Yeah? And you can see on this transparency, as you probably imagine here, a model system for a solar cell. Well, if you don't recognize it immediately, there's a red thing here, that's a light absorber, that's a porphyrin ring, so it's basically just a molecular dye here, which can absorb light in the visible range. So you form an electron-hole pair excitation here if light in the red range here gets absorbed. Yeah? And then you see on the right-hand side, there's a fullerene electron acceptor. And so what will happen if the light is absorbed in the porphyrin, an electron will jump over to the fullerene, and so you have a charge separation or an electron transfer reaction in this system. Okay. So that's the optical spectra. So you see here that in the range around 500 to 600 nanometer, you have absorption of the porphyrin ring here. So light gets absorbed here, and we want to follow what is happening to basically these electrons in the system upon light absorption. And we do this because some friends of ours, in particular the group of Elisa Molinari, that's the young lady here, a theoretical physics professor from Modena in Italy, has done some advanced calculations on this that are shown some few years back, that are shown here. And she has predicted essentially that here is electronic charge on the fullerene that is on the electron acceptor as a function of time. She has predicted that there's a very fast electron transfer in this system, and that there are charge oscillations. So basically she was predicting that charges are oscillating back and forth between the light absorber, the porphyrin ring, and the electron acceptor. And this stuff is highly controversial because in the moment nobody knows whether these theoretical models that are used are reliable, whether they can predict such processes here. The technique that is used is time-dependent density functional theory, and nobody has seen this in the lab. In fact, first experiments by other groups suggested that charge transfer here in this system should only happen on a picosecond time scale. So we thought that we ask a friend to help us a little bit, that's Giulio Giulio from Milano, to help us a little bit in building up fast laser systems here with time resolution on the order of 10 femtoseconds to look into this process. And the stuff that you do in the lab is very simple. You take a first laser, you impulsively excite the system, and then you follow the changes in the optical spectrum, in the optical transmission through the layer as a function of the time between this first pump pulse and the second probe pulse here. And you see in the raw data that I show here that if you shine red light onto this porphyrin ring here, this will initiate a lot of action here in the optical spectrum. You see plenty of oscillations here, you see bands shifting, and we wanted to understand that. Yeah? Many of these oscillations are simple vibrational resonances in the system, so optical impulsive excitation sets the molecule into motion. We understand this since a long time, and we can just take it off the data. Yeah? And then when we did this, after subtracting this, we're very surprised because these optical spectra here showed a band which is shifting enormously with time. So you see that the resonance frequency here changes, for wavelengths changes from 540 to 580 nanometer as a function of time on a 100 femtosecond time scale. Why should a molecular band shift? Well, typically that's the origin is some sort of Stark effect. Yeah? So you have an electric field that is acting on the molecule and that is shifting the resonance, as you learn from atomic physics. Here, that's natural to have this because we want to probe a charge transfer process. During this charge transfer process, we build up a dipole inside the molecule. Yeah, so light excitation forms an exciton, and then you form a dipole because the electron moves a long distance here. So in this resonance shift, you see this quick build-up of a dipole moment inside the molecule. And then this rise was even more pronounced when we compared this shift in wavelengths to this buildup of the charge that was predicted some few years back by theory. Yeah? And you can see that both the time scales match, yeah? And also these oscillations match. Yeah? So here a comparison between experiment and theory suggested that indeed this prediction of ultra-fast charge transfer process in this molecule seems to be correct, and that also there seems to be electronic coherence here preserved during the charge transfer. The question is, why does this happen? And let's assume that we can take the TD-DFT calculation seriously. Yeah? Then we can understand a little bit why this is happening. Because in the calculations, okay, I just showed the movie. Yeah? So watch how this charge is moving. Yeah? Okay? So I explain a little bit. Purple is an excess electronic density. Green is an excess or is not enough electron density. You see as a purple color here the buildup of charge of electronic density on the fullerene. I replay it if I can. So you see in purple, hopefully, how charges are building up on the fullerene on a 20 femtosecond time scale. Charge is moving over. Yeah? And then as the movie goes on, you will see that it's getting more green again. So the charge is flowing back. And you can watch essentially how this electron is moving like from the electron donor to the electron acceptor. And you can also understand from the simulations why this is so. Simulations predict actually there's two effects. First of all, you have to have strong vibronic coupling. So you have to have a fast oscillation period here in this molecule. And then also you have to have flexibility of the molecule. The molecule must be able to respond to this change in charge configuration, and this will trap the electron in the acceptor. And you can see this again in the simulation if you just change the structure of the molecule a little bit by bridging some, or linking some, or fixing some linker groups here between the porphyrin and the fullerene. You can stop the charge transfer completely. So essentially here we have found the first example, one of the few examples here, where apparently one can describe photoinduced electron transfer as the coupling between one electron, the coherent coupling between one electronic level and one other electronic level. And apparently vibronic coupling to vibrations is also important. Here, the model system that we have used is a covalently bound molecule. Yeah? So basically you can have tunnel coupling through this linker group between the porphyrin and the fullerene. You may say, okay, if we bring them very close, it's not surprising that there is tunnel coupling. So is this relevant at all? Yeah, so here that was a molecule in solution. This may not actually be relevant for technological devices. So we thought about going one step further and replacing, and we tried to replace this molecule by just a regular garden variety thin film solar cell. So we basically take like one of these solar cells that you can put on your roof. It's an organic solar cell. It's like one of these prototypical systems, a polymer, P3HT, and a fullerene derivative, PCBM. Yeah? And we study in a technological functional solar cell, again, this electron transfer reaction. Yeah? So, okay, just how does this solar cell supposedly work? The idea is that a photon is absorbed in the P3HT region. Then typically it's assumed that there's exciton diffusion, and eventually there will be exciton dissociation, and the formation, and an electron will transfer over to the fullerene electron acceptor. It's known that this electron transfer process here is, at least for some of the molecules, with a high probability, is relatively fast on 100 femtosecond timescale. So again, we wanted to see whether coherence that we have observed before is relevant in these systems. That's a pretty odd question to ask, because if we look at such cells, it's a highly disordered mess of a polymer, yeah, at room temperature, mixed with basically C60 molecules that are randomly dispersed in this material. You form lots of interfaces. All interfaces are different, and if you want to think about this, it's basically like something like having spaghetti with meatballs, not necessarily the best system to look into quantum coherent phenomena here. Yeah? So definitely heavily disordered. Yeah? Okay, so the trick that we played was again the same. We used regular pump probe spectroscopy, but with high time resolution. So we took short laser to excite here the P3HT, the polymer, which has an absorption band here, yeah? And we followed basically the change in optical, in the transient optical spectra. And these are the results. The results are again complicated. So what you can watch here, what you can see here is the change in transmission after impulsive excitation of such a P3HT PCBM thin film at room temperature as a function of time. You can see basically this in the spectral region here from 440 to 530 nanometer, and you can see plenty of oscillations in different regions here. Okay, yeah. So when you see these oscillations, what physicists do is they take Fourier spectra, and we did this, of course. And you see different regions here. In this region between 520 and 500 nanometer, you see a motion, a strong vibrational resonance here at 1450 nanometer. That's not very surprising, because optical excitation will induce CC stretch motion of the polymer. So the polymer just starts to oscillate, okay? No problem. This happens both in a pure polymer, but also in a blend, yeah? So this has to be so, because optical excitation of the polymer will basically induce the displacement of charges, and this triggers vibrational motion. This was not a surprise, but this was. We did the same thing here in this range between 480 and 500 nanometer, and there in the blended material, we see that also the fullerene starts to oscillate. This is something that we didn't expect at all, because we were exciting one pendulum here, and another one was starting to oscillate. Yeah? So, okay, so what can you conclude? You can conclude that there must be a coupling between the two. Yeah? So somehow the polymer must be very rapidly coupled to the C60 electron acceptor, what means very rapidly, more rapidly than one vibrational period. Yeah? So somehow charge must flow over from P3HD to PCBM on a time scale that is faster than one vibrational period. So there must be extremely fast electron transfer reaction. But you don't see this in the optical spectrum, so somehow there must be coherent oscillation of the charges here. We tried to confirm this by theory, and we did again time-dependent density functional theory. And I will show you the movie. So this is how we think about the charge transfer from the P3HD PCBM in a disordered system. You see that the electrons are basically just oscillating back and forth with a period of 20 femtoseconds. So again, we have Rabi oscillations now in a technologically relevant system here. Okay. Why does this occur? Well, okay, theory again tells us a little bit about it. What is plotted here is first in green the charge that is excited, or the fractional charge that is excited on the C60 region of the molecule, and you see that basically there's a transfer of charge on a 20 femtosecond time scale, and then you see that it's oscillating back and forth and back and forth until it somehow stays there. We can only do these calculations up to like 100 femtoseconds because they take like 1 day per femtosecond roughly here. Yeah? Okay, but they also indicate why this is so. Because like if we set this molecule into motion, the electronic chain states of the molecule will change in response to this vibrational motion. So essentially you have two pendula that may be off resonance at the beginning, yeah, and then molecular vibrations set in, and they bring the states into resonance, and that's where the charge can flow. Yeah? So you have to have two types of strong coupling here. There's a strong coupling to the vibrational modes, but also strong coupling to this neighboring electronic excitation. So that's what we concluded from these calculations. And these experiments that I've shown, these femtosecond spectroscopy experiments, were a little bit indirect at the time, so we thought about whether we can probe these vibronic coherences in a little bit more direct way. And what femtosecond spectroscopists do is they take a very sensitive method that is two-dimensional optical spectroscopy. So basically, instead of exciting the sample with one pulse, you take a microsyntheterophometer, you split your pulses into two phase-locked pulses, and you use those to excite the system. Why would you do this? Well, because these two pulses here in the spectral domain will give you some comb-like structure. So your molecule, your optical excitation, may either like overlap with a node here in the optical pulse or with a maximum here, and when you vary the time delay between these two pulses, you can modulate whether you excite a certain resonance or not. So that's the main idea. Yeah? So it's a modulation type of spectroscopy with which you can decide whether you want to excite a certain resonance here or whether you do not want this. Okay? Yeah? And we did this here. The results that I show are just on a pure polymer. So basically, it's just a thin layer of polymer, just a thin layer of plastics, 100 nanometer thick or a little less, 50 nanometer thick. And we did this on this first because you can describe the optical spectrum of such a polymer relatively easily. Yeah? So this is a measured absorption spectrum of a thin film of P3HD at room temperature, and you can model this within basically a displaced harmonic oscillator model reasonably well. That's a fit. This red line is a fit to the experimental data here, taking just these potential curves into account. Yeah? there's a rather large displacement. We call this the Huang-Ruiz factor. That's the displacement between the local minimum here along the vibrational coordinate here and this here. Yeah? So basically this is the structure that we're looking at, P3HT. Yeah? You may consider it like this. Yeah? And we can describe it reasonably well as two coupled harmonic oscillators, at least the linear spectrum. Okay? Now, I still have time to explain this a little bit. I will show some results of 2D spectra that we recorded, and the important point here is that the time resolution that we have in these experiments is roughly like 10 femtoseconds or a little less. So the time resolution that we have is less than one of the vibrational modes of the system. Okay? So we can see like all the vibrational motion, it basically standing still because the flashes of light that we have are fast enough. Okay? So here is such a two-dimensional optical spectrum. So basically what I show is the change of transmission of the sample, now not just as a function of the color of the probe pulse, that's this axis, but also sort of as the color of the excitation pulse. Yeah? It's a little bit cheating here, but okay, to make things simple. Yeah? And you see that basically in red are regions in this plot where the transmission is getting reduced. Yeah? It's getting increased. So basically here you have bleaching of excitons. This bleaching of excitons increases the transmission, and you can follow this. Yeah? And now what you can do in these diagrams, you can look at certain combinations of excitation wavelengths and detection wavelengths here, and you can see what would happen to this system if you were to excite it with, like, say, color of 580 nanometer, assumed to be extremely fast, and you probe at this resonance. So essentially, in this diagram, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. Yeah, you can selectively excite and probe the system. And what you see here is lots of basic, and you can do this. You can plot these amplitudes here as a function of time. Yeah, and you can see very nicely how these optical spectra here are modulated due to the vibrational motion of the system. You can do this at other resonances, and other resonances. And you see basically here that in all of these regions you see vibronic coherences. And that's not particularly surprising, because if we take this very simple model here of two displaced harmonic oscillators, yeah, and we perform, it's a bit complicated, we perform time-dependent density matrix simulations. Here, using a non-perturbative approach, we can basically simulate this data, and we get, at all of these peak combinations here, we get more or less the same oscillations that we see in the experiment. Yeah? So what does it mean? We see the vibronic wave packet motion. So in the polymer, we see how an optical excitation sets the polymer into motion, and we can follow this, and apparently this vibronic coherence lives for a very long time. So far, there's nothing surprising about this. Yeah? We have learned this by a combination of femtosecond spectroscopy here and relatively advanced theoretical simulation. And essentially, the more we look into these systems with high spatial and with high time resolution, the more we see that quantum coherence is playing a role, even in systems that were believed to be model systems for incoherent dynamics. Yeah? And it's really in the sense that the better we look, the more we see, and the less we understand, because we can start to probe these motions in real time, but at the moment there's no theory that can explain what we're doing. We have general quantum mechanics or quantum chemistry, which sort of does not treat electrons and vibrational motion on the same footing. We have time-dependent density functional theory, which is so complicated that it's also not even able to simulate time-dependent spectra. So we're in a very interesting process of learning about the dynamics of charge excitation or photoinduced charge transfer processes in complex nanomaterials, and these are relevant for quite a variety, as I've alluded to in the beginning, of photophysical processes, and I think there will be a very interesting development of this field in the very near future. Thank you for the attention.